NDAs in ministries, in churches, is a hot button issue today, and it should be. And we've done a lot of work in this area, especially with the NDA disclosure database. Why? Why do we work so hard on it? Why do we fight for transparency and education around church NDAs? Because they are often tied to spiritual abuse cases. Just because a church or ministry uses an NDA does not mean they're abusive or unhealthy or toxic or any of those things. But almost every time we find a spiritual abuse case, we find NDAs somewhere in that. So this is a red flag issue that Christians have got to start paying more attention to. And this week, some police interviews were finally released from the Daystar investigation into the alleged SA of baby lamb. Now, if you were not familiar with the Daystar investigation, we started covering this over a year ago. There are plenty of videos on our channel that you can check out about that to get caught up. But what we're looking at today is not the guilt of anyone. We're not saying someone's guilty or not guilty, anything like that. What we're going to look at, I want to look at some things that were uncovered in the police interviews about this allegation. In the police interviews, NDAs from Daystar as a ministry came up. And I think there's some very important things that we can learn about NDAs here. And we're going to shine a light on some of the things that were said. Are they true? Are they not true? Are they partially true? And we're going to shine a light on some of the things that are often said about church NDAs that lead us to believe something different about church NDAs than is reality. So I think you're going to learn a lot about this stuff today, but let's go ahead and get into it. And we're going to be able to do something today that we don't normally do on these videos, and we don't normally get to do in articles about NDAs. Generally, we don't share any part of the NDA. We don't quote a word from it. We don't share any elements from it to protect the people who are sharing these anonymously from retaliation. In this scenario, we were given this NDA months ago when looking into Daystar. Okay, so we were able to obtain a copy of this NDA. We are not going to share the whole thing, but because we obtained this copy outside of the NDA database and because we obtained it under different circumstances, we're going to be able to share just a little bit of this to really look at what's being said versus what is reality. And often we will get churches and ministries who will give us statements who will say, hey, we only use NDAs that, and they'll give us information about it. We only use NDAs that protect personal information. These are good NDAs. They only protect financial information, counseling information, stuff like that. And sometimes that is true, but if that's true, we're not reporting on it. But if we're reporting on it, what you'll see often in our articles is that's what they said. That doesn't match the document that we saw. Today, in one of the few instances where we get to do this, you're going to see why some of the things that are said don't match the documents that we saw. Now, this is not Daystar's statement. We are actually doing an article on this for the NDA database. Daystar did not give us a statement. That article is not up yet, but it is coming. But what we're going to look at is what are just some of the things that J.W. Weiss and Rebecca Lamb Weiss actually said about these NDAs. It's going to shine a light on quite a few things. So let's go ahead and let's listen to this together.
He can obviously vouch for it, but because the accusation was made, if there's an NDA saying you can't talk about a sexual abuse of a child, that's negated.
Yeah.
Okay, I understand. Yeah. That was the accusation.
The NDA,
All right, so what you got here, if you're looking in this video, you see J.W. Weiss, you see Rebecca Lamb Weiss. The person right to the left of them in this video is their lawyer, but not only their lawyer, as far as I understand, that's one of Daystar's lawyers who is sent with them. That's not super weird in this situation to have a lawyer with you. It is a little bit odd to have your organization that you work for, your employer's lawyer coming with you. But again, Daystar is, for all intents and purposes, in a lot of ways, it operates like a family business or a family ministry while also trying to operate as a big organization. And a part of the Daystar investigation that has made all of this so difficult is that so much family is involved, and the idea of protecting the family from looking bad is involved. So again, an attorney being with them, not that big of a deal, but that is who is with them listening. So the person behind the table is the detective, and you hear the detective say, hey, I just want to talk about NDAs for a second. He, pointing to the lawyer, can corroborate this, but he's essentially reminding them under the law, if you signed an NDA, the NDA doesn't actually hold up to keep you from talking to me about this child SA case. All right. Now, this is something that a lot of people don't know because there have been many instances where churches and ministries have made people feel like they can't go to the courts. They can't talk about certain things. They're not sure about what they can talk about, even if it was potentially illegal. And in this situation, you're going to see as they're being interviewed, much of what they talk about is not illegal. It's not an illegal act, but it's important information to an investigation. A lot of people don't know this. So if you don't, this is important to know. An NDA can never keep you from reporting an illegal act, but an NDA cannot keep you from talking to detectives, from helping with an investigation, or anything like that. If you're not sure, talk to an attorney. But this is important because most people don't get to this point. A lot of times you may have a detective calling, trying to interview people, and because they sign that NDA, they ghost the detective. They don't talk to the detective. They're not trying to talk to anybody without a subpoena. And the reality is they're doing that because they're scared of the NDAs when they don't have to. So why did the detective, though? This is a very important question. Why did this detective early on in his very first interview with JW and Rebecca about the situation? Why did he think it was so important to make clear if you signed an NDA, that does not keep you from discussing anything here? I think there's a couple of reasons. One, he has been a part of this for long enough to know that a lot of people involved with companies, ministries, everything else, the NDAs have been used to keep people silent or to keep them fearful. And because of that fear, keep them silent from cooperating with investigations. It's important enough and he's seen it enough to talk about it. The other thing is he knows that there is an NDA floating around somewhere. That's something that has been reported by Jonathan and Susie Lamb. It's been reported by the Roy's Report. It's been reported by a bunch of different outlets from the very beginning that when Jonathan was trying to work through these situations, trying to get information out, that when they were worried, and at least when it looked like they were worried that he was going to potentially go public or go to the media, they tried to get him to all of a sudden sign an NDA. And it's been reported that they asked all the executives, which are basically just family members, all of the family to sign these NDAs. And if you're not familiar with the investigation, there's even recordings of the board meeting where they tried to pressure Jonathan Lamb into signing this NDA. So, because this detective knows there's an NDA in here somewhere, and he seemingly has had a hard time when you listen to all of these videos, and if you want to listen to them in their entirety and not miss any of the stuff that we cut out for time and brevity, you can actually go to Julie Roy's YouTube channel. She has them kind of all on there for the most part unaltered. But he knows this NDA is here. He knows this NDA has a high likelihood of keeping people from talking. And it seems like he had a bit of a difficult time getting together with JW and Rebecca. And that before he got with them for this interview, and it seems like they cooperate really well, guys. So I'm not trying to throw shade at them in any way, but it seems like before he got them in there, when you hear him talk about this stuff, that he was under the impression that they may not want to talk to him because of the family, because of Daystar, because of the NDA, because of all those things. All that stuff is swirling around. So this detective thought it was important very early on in this interview to make clear NDAs should not keep you silent. And if this wasn't a big issue, if NDAs didn't often keep people silent, he wouldn't have had to have said that.
I don't even remember. I'm sure we can get you a copy of it. It's very
I'm sure.
corporate.
Basic.
Don't go online and slander your org. If there's secrets, or not secrets, sorry. If there's, proprietary information,
stuff,
as any business, as this company has.
All right. So a couple of things he said there. JW is trying to make the case. And again, he's right there is a lawyer, but this isn't just his lawyer. This is an attorney, from everything I understand, for Daystar as well. Okay. So you got to picture Joni Lamb is not just his mother-in-law. Joni Lamb is his employer. And Joni went after Jonathan Lamb pretty hard. There's been a lot of what looks like retaliation in this situation with Jonathan Lamb. Jonathan lost his job. Jonathan has been separated from his family in a lot of ways. He and Susie have had to pay a big price for going public about these things, for pursuing this investigation. So you can see there would be a lot of fear here. And I wonder if that's part of the reason why he feels like he needs to clarify, because he's going above and beyond to clarify. Well, I mean, I'm sure I could get you a copy, but the NDA, it's basic. It says don't slander the company online. And we're going to ask the question here in a minute. We're going to look, is that true? I don't think that's what it says. I don't think that's true. I'm going to let you see, let you be the judge. But he also says, hey, it's just really basic. It's don't share trade secrets. That is partially true. Part of it is about trade secrets, but I think it goes much farther than that. So he says it's just a basic corporate NDA. So I want you to ask these questions as we look at this later. We're going to say, does it just keep people from slandering Daystar online? Does it just keep the signer from sharing trade secrets? And is it a basic corporate NDA? We're going to ask all of those questions. I think the answer is no or partially no on all of those because there's a lot more here.
Anyone has. That's to remain proprietary. That's it. That's the NDA.
I had two other questions I was going to ask.
All right. So this, if you notice the change, this is the second interview. So that's what they said about NDAs in the first interview. This is the second interview. And you're going to notice in the second interview, again, very early on, or I think it was very early on, but in the second interview, he wants to go back to this. The detective comes back to this because in both interviews, this is a very important piece of what he wants to get across about the NDA. So let's listen to what he has to say. Ask the question, why would this detective be bringing this up again when they've already made it clear? And then again, listen to JW and Rebecca and how they talk about this with the attorney right there.
Either one of you guys, whoever get it, can I get a copy of that NDA? Like, it doesn't have to be a signed copy or anything. I just want to know what it entails. Yeah. Yeah, because
By the way, just listen to all of them. Listen to the way that JW was explaining the last time, how he explains this time, how Rebecca explains the NDAs. It feels to me like there's a lot of him hawing around. Like this, it's almost like they're dancing around a landmine and everybody is scared to step in the wrong place. The same thing with the detective. He's bringing this back up, but he's trying to be soft. He's trying to be tactful. He's dancing around this idea of this NDA. Why is this NDA such a big deal if it is just a standard corporate NDA?
the other side is claiming it's NDA for this stuff.
It's not.
Yeah,
It's
okay.
not. It's
That's-
really basic, right?
I mean, it's just.
All right, if it's really basic, and this is a small thing, again, I'm not throwing shade at Rebecca, but it's a really basic NDA, right? You don't have to look at your husband and say, right, if you are sure. When I'm sure about something, oh, it's a basic NDA. Here's the things it had in it. Actually, we brought you this copy today. But no, they still haven't shown him a copy of it. Oh, it's a basic NDA, right? There are some questions there. I think their official stance, and to a degree what they believe, is it's a basic NDA because they've been told this is a basic NDA. All corporations do this. Jonathan and Susie, it feels like they may have been told Jonathan and Susie are overreacting about this. They just don't understand it, right? But by asking that question, it's just a basic NDA, right? By asking it that way, it shows me that Rebecca is likely not sure. And her and JW have probably had conversations about this. That's what it looks like to me, that they are not sure. And again, we'll ask this question, is it just a basic NDA or is it more? The detective also said the other side has said that this is an NDA that covers the other stuff. I don't know what Jonathan and Susie said. That's how he took it. My guess is they're saying this is an NDA that could make someone feel like they can't share this stuff, because the NDA does not spell out in any place you can't talk about these illegal acts. But as you're going to see, the NDA actually, it leaves a lot of room for someone to wonder.
Regular executive NDA that's,
Yeah, I just wanted to read it.
Sure.
See, but
All right. So he says it's just a regular executive NDA. So let's ask here in a minute, is this a regular executive NDA? Is this just a basic NDA? We're going to ask that question. But again, you heard the detective trying to be real soft as he brought this subject up. And then when he says it's just a basic executive NDA, yeah, I just wanted to see it, make sure. Why is he still pushing? Because this detective has likely been told many times by many people that they just signed a basic NDA. And he's probably been around this long enough to know most NDAs are probably not basic NDAs. There's a lot of things that can get in those. And he probably wants to look to see, are there gray areas? Are there things that could make a person feel like they can't talk, they can't be honest in these interviews? So let's go ahead and let's look at this together. All right. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. You see the article here that the Roy's report just put out. We're going to get into that in the next segment. Daystar couple tells police their suspicions that brother-in-law S.A.'d baby lamb. Pete's identity revealed. But we're not getting into that deeply right now. Here's what I want to do. I want to go ahead and I want to start, first of all, by just looking at some different pieces of this NDA and asking some questions. Again, we're sharing just a couple of very small, relevant snippets of this NDA that we have obtained that was reported to be used by Daystar. We have had it for months, haven't shown any piece of it, but I think it's relevant to show it now because in these interviews, some of the things that they said about this NDA don't seem to hold up from my vantage point. But again, I'm gonna let you be the judge. So let's go ahead and let's look at this together. This is part of this NDA. All right, this is a section on confidential information. Let's ask these questions. Is this just keeping people from slandering Daystar online? Is this just a basic regular NDA? Is this just about trade secrets? All right. Confidential information. For the purpose of this agreement, the term confidential information means in any NDA, it has got to define what confidential means. There's a lot of different definitions of this. If it doesn't define it, it is likely not going to hold up in court at all. All right. Now, you see, this is a big paragraph. This is a big definition. One of the things we look for when deciding if something is a silencing NDA or not is we look for an overly broad definition of confidentiality. So ask yourself as well, does this definition seem overly broad? Many attorneys are going to tell you when you're signing an NDA, you want the definition of confidential to be as narrow as possible and as clear as possible. You want to know exactly what is confidential. You don't want to have any questions. Hey, is this something I'm supposed to share or not? For the purposes of this agreement, the term confidential means all trade secrets as defined in the Texas Uniform Trade Secrets Act. That's totally fine. And other information about Daystar and its business operations that is proprietary, private, and not generally known or accessible to members of the public, media, press, detractors of Daystar. All right, so let's just stop right there because there's a lot here. It is normal to protect in an NDA proprietary information. Although in a good NDA, you're going to explain how the person knows it's proprietary. So there's no question. Okay, you're going to see that here in just a second. Business operations, to a degree, that's normal. Private gets into a gray area because what does private mean? If you don't define private, one person can have a very different definition of private information than another. And this is a part of a lot of NDAs, but if it doesn't come with clarifying language, it's a concern to me. Information not generally known or accessible to members of the public. Now, let's just stop there. That is not necessarily bad. But if it is not clarified, there are a lot of things that are not proprietary information. They are not trade secrets. There are a lot of things, especially in Christian ministry, and Daystar is a Christian ministry that I believe with the IRS is still classified as a church. That's why they don't file a 990 form. When you're in Christian ministry, there's a lot of things that aren't proprietary information and trade secrets that could happen that could be immoral, that could be questionable, that could be cerning, that could be a reason for potential reproach, that could be a reason to ask questions about, get clarification about. So just by saying this is information not generally known to the public, if information that wasn't generally known to the public wasn't reported, we wouldn't have any news. Because what is the purpose of press? It is to actually bring, in a lot of places, accountability to organizations where they don't want accountability. So just anything that's not public knowledge being marked as confidential, I think that is dangerous. That is my opinion, but especially with the ministry and church, unless that is also paired with a much more detailed information, I think it's dangerous. So by itself, it's not dangerous, but let's ask, does it give a lot more detail to what kind of information not known about the public, or is it overly broad? But it's this next piece that really bothers me that is connected to it. Confidential information is anything not generally known or accessible to members of the public, but also the media, press, or detractors of Daystar. Usually putting things like the media and the press, that is not a normal thing I've seen in a lot of NDAs. I've seen it in a lot of church and ministry NDAs. I've not seen it in a lot of NDA kind of templates and stuff like that. All right. Now, I've not seen it in a lot of business NDAs that I've had to sign over the years. But one thing that I definitely don't see is detractors. When you have to put in detractors of Daystar, then what you're saying here together, in my opinion, is, hey, you can't share anything that's not generally known to the public. You can't share that with the public. You can't share that with media. You can't share that with press. You can't share that with detractors. By putting press, media, and detractors in there, it gives the appearance that things need to be hidden and you're trying to hide things. But let's continue and just see what this definition says. Whether or not in written or recorded form, concerning business operations or affairs of Daystar and its affiliates and subsidiaries, confidential information includes without limitation. Here's some more of the things it includes: information designated as confidential by Daystar or any officer or trustee. Now, think about that. Not all the officers and the trustees. So, by this definition, if Joni Lamb said anything by herself, oh, that's confidential, then all the other executives have to treat it as confidential, whether they agree or not. That's it. That is dangerous to me. Things that are confidential, proprietary, trade secrets, I believe they should have to be marked that way by a full governing board. But that's what it's saying. Confidential information includes anything that is said this is confidential by a Daystar officer or trustee. Now, let's ask the other question as well. These beach trips, and they're going to come up in a later segment as we look at these police interviews. But a lot of the allegations about what Pete did to Baby Lamb or what was alleged to have been done, that those SA allegations, a lot of that was happening at these beach trips. But if you remember in the investigation, if I'm not mistaken, those beach trips were family beach trips with the Lamb family. They're going to talk about those being family beach trips. Yet, I believe they were also called corporate retreats, that it was a retreat for Daystar. So if you're on this family beach trip, but it's technically labeled a corporate retreat for Daystar, and you're there, and Joni Lamb says, oh, that thing that just happened while we were all at the beach house together as a family, that's confidential. Do you see how this document could lead a person to believe, that's a Daystar trustee or executive who marked it as confidential? That meets the definition of confidential. And this is technically a Daystar thing because we're not just family, we're technically all on staff here. Well, then you got to ask the question, are those things confidential or not? Most of us would just say that's a family vacation, but it would be easy for Daystar to say that's confidential information. It continues in 2 here. Any information relating to Daystar's viewers, partners, employees, officers, trustees, board of trustees, and their respective actions and decisions. This part is very important to me. Now, is there potentially some proprietary information around Daystar's viewers, partners, and employees? Yes. But when you include employees, officers, trustees, board of trustees, and you include this phrase, and their respective actions and decisions, the actions of leadership in a corporation are not confidential by nature. They're not proprietary by nature. If these are actions that are connected to an invention, that would be proprietary. Okay. If they're actions that are connected to a business deal that hasn't closed yet, that would be proprietary. But there are a whole lot of actions by executives that should be reported to HR. There's a whole lot of actions that would be newsworthy, that may not be illegal, may not be a reason to fire that person, but if the general public found out, they would go, that's not something that we want to see in these businesses. You see that stuff reported all the time. So there's a huge area of moral concern, especially in a ministry, that would qualify as employees, officers, trustees, and board of trustees' respective actions and decisions. This is, in my opinion, again, way too overly broad. Because especially when Joni Lamb has made decisions like saying, hey, we had a polygraph done, everything else, I prayed about it, I believe this person's innocent, so drop it. Well, that's a respective action. That's a respective decision. So should that be kept confidential? By this document, it would make a person think yes, if it had been signed. Number 3, it's about Daystar's financial condition, business cost, income, profits, losses. That stuff is normal. Everything about a company's finances shouldn't be confidential, especially if there's misuse of finances. But generally, yes, you don't want to talk about deals being done. You don't want to talk about financial liquidity and all of that. So that stuff is pretty normal. Number 5 is pretty normal as well. But the question becomes, is this a standard NDA? Because JW said it's an NDA. It's only about proprietary information. So let's ask the question first. All right. Confidential. This had nothing to do with the social media stuff that he's talking about. That's going to be a different place, I believe he got that from. Okay, so this part had nothing to do with social media. This part had nothing to do with slandering people online. This would have had to do with him saying trade secrets, proprietary information, basic company NDA stuff. So let's go ahead and let's look back at this together. And I'm actually going to show you a different document. Let's look at two other documents right here. All right. This is a basic. It's literally called right here in the left, a basic non-disclosure agreement, basic NDA template. Let's look at how it talks about this stuff. Definition of confidential information. Let's look at it in a basic NDA. For the purposes of this agreement, confidential information shall include all information or material that has or could have commercial value or other utility in the business in which the disclosing party is engaged. This is an important part that should be, in my opinion, in every NDA. Okay, if you're actually protecting trade secrets and proprietary information, one of the things courts are going to look at in most states, if not all states, is did that information have monetary value to competitors? There's a whole lot of stuff that's covered in Daystar's definition of confidential information, from my perspective, that has nothing to do with that. And I didn't see much of anything in Daystar's definition that talked about, hey, what's the monetary value of this? What's the commercial value of this? Because the whole point of these agreements and the whole point of trade secret laws and stuff like that is that you're not going to work for a company just to siphon off and sell information to one of their competitors so that they can do it better and put them out of business. Okay. That is very different from what I'm getting from Daystar's NDA, right? It says if confidential information is in written form, the disclosing party shall label or stamp the materials with the word confidential or some similar warning. So what this agreement is doing is saying, hey, you shouldn't have to wonder. If it's confidential, they should make that clear. And if it's written, it should be stamped. It should be in there. If it's in an email, it should be in there. You shouldn't have to wonder. Go back to Daystar's definition of confidential in their NDA, and I think we're left with a lot of questions, a lot of wondering what's confidential and what is not. Again, a basic corporate NDA on the surface looks very, very different. It says if confidential information is transmitted orally, verbally, the disclosing party shall promptly provide writing indicating that such oral communication constituted confidential information. So either right before that meeting or right after that meeting, you should get something in writing that says, hey, what we're going to talk about or what we just talked about, that was confidential. Okay. Now, again, go back to Daystars. Do you see it being that clear? Where a person should never have any question if something is confidential or not. That doesn't seem to be the case with Daystar stuff. Okay. And you're always going to have exclusions from confidential information. So once you look at the exclusions here, once you look at the definition, it is very clear what's confidential, what's not. Let's look at another one. Now, this corporate NDA is a template specifically for employee NDAs. So this first one could be an employee, doesn't necessarily have to be an employee. The second one's for employees. It's going to look a little bit more like Daystar's, but let's again ask, does Daystar's NDA fit the definition of what JW is saying when he says this is a basic corporate NDA? So let's go ahead and let's look at one, the scope of the agreement, certain information, trade secrets, and proprietary data. It is very much so focused on trade secrets, proprietary data. Confidential information. How does this one define it? Confidential information is any material, information, and data concerning the company or its businesses not generally known to the public. Now, again, I don't like that phrase by itself, but the question is what comes after it? Is it clarified, or is it just broadly, if something's not known to the public, then it's considered confidential? But this says what that information not generally known to the public consists of. And a court would look at this and generally would say, okay, well, these aren't the only things that would be confidential information, but confidential information would be information not generally known to the public that falls in the same vein as these things, but not limited to inventions, discoveries, plans, concepts, designs, blueprints, drawings, models, devices, equipment, apparatus, products, prototypes, formulae, algorithms, techniques, research. And guys, here's the thing. All of this stuff, when you look at it, all of this is things that we would normally see as proprietary information, but this is a template. It's overly broad. An organization using this should pick the actual things that apply to them. It shouldn't even be this broad. Was Daystar's this specific? And did Daystars have anything extra that broadened it? Again, think about any of the respective actions or decisions of executives. Do you see anything like that in this one? And then it says any other concepts, ideas, information involved or relating to the business, which, this is important, if misused or disclosed, could adversely affect the company's business. Well, how would a court decide if it could adversely affect the company's business? Well, usually that's going to be in most cases because there was monetary value in it being shared with somebody else. So, again, when you look at a basic corporate NDA, at both of these other basic corporate NDAs, what we find is they look very, very different from what we see in the Daystar NDA because we don't see as broad of a definition in any of those others. And we definitely don't see information, the respective actions and decisions of executives being covered by this. We don't see any other of these NDAs saying information that's not known to the public, media, press, or detractors of the company. That's not in it. It stops at public and then goes into deep information. So you got to ask the question with this, right? You got to ask a couple of different questions. But the biggest one is this Daystar NDA a basic NDA, a basic corporate NDA like JW said, like Rebecca says later? And I would have to say that's a no. Now, I don't think JW was just being dishonest. I think JW doesn't know because I don't think JW has a lot of corporate experience. I think most of his work experience looks to be coming from Daystar. So if Joni and her lawyers are telling him this is just a basic corporate NDA, it would make a lot of sense for him to believe it. But I also believe they have concerns, which is why Rebecca probably said, well, it's just a basic NDA, right? As she looks to her husband. If you do much research, you're going to realize this is not just a basic NDA. This is not just a template. This one has been crafted, and it looks to have been crafted pretty carefully. So, in my opinion, it doesn't fit a basic corporate NDA, but it also fits many of the qualifications, the elements, just in the definition of confidential, of being an overly broad confidentiality definition, which is part of the elements that we look for in a silencing NDA. But let's look at a little bit more of this because that is not everything. B, confidential information shall not include, and it's going to give you basic things like confidential information can't be something that you already knew from your training or from general knowledge. It also can't be information that's readily ascertainable to the public because if they're trying to say this is confidential, but the public knows, then it's not really confidential anymore. And then third, information that employee has a duty or right to disclose as legally protected conduct. That part's pretty normal. That is normal. That should be in most NDAs. That is pretty basic. But again, when you're dealing with something like this, so you know, if I have a duty or a right to disclose this as legally protected, then I can share it. But what about in this situation with Rebecca and JW? They're being interviewed by a detective, and most of the way they're going to answer these questions, they're not saying they've seen criminal activity. They're saying they've seen suspicious, concerning, questionable activity, and it's very relevant to the investigation. So, can I talk about this, or can I only talk about like if I actually saw a for sure crime? That leaves a lot of concerns. It leaves a lot of questions. But let's go ahead and let's keep looking. There's a couple of other pieces I want to look at with this basic NDA. Here's something important. And again, we're trying to only show you the bare minimum here. This little clause, executives shall not at any time during or after termination of executive service as an officer or trustee. The reason why I wanted to highlight that and point that there is to remind you this NDA, I didn't see anything as I looked through it that showed an NDA, an end date. And we have had on other videos that we've done, I have shown you attorneys talking about it, saying a good NDA will almost always have an end date. An NDA that says you got to keep stuff confidential in perpetuity forever is overly burdensome on someone, hangs over their head for their entire life. Courts are not usually going to uphold those. But this one, this wasn't just something where, hey, you can't disclose things while you're on staff. It's after termination. After you're off staff, you still can't disclose these things. And I also thought it was important to note, I don't, again, think this is a standard NDA because they've got a non-competition clause. a non-compete. Hey, for 2 years after you leave, you can't engage in anything else that does Christian programming similar to what's provided by Daystar anywhere in the world. Now, you might say, oh, that makes sense. He doesn't need to go work for another TV station. But the question is, what if he started a podcast or a YouTube channel? They have podcasts, they're on YouTube. Couldn't they? That's media. Couldn't they say that's similar? They're classified or operating as a church with the IRS, by my understanding. So, couldn't they say that if you went to work for a church, that is similar? But also, a non compete is usually a totally separate agreement. When I have seen non competes, they're a separate agreement. Non competes and non solicitation clauses, as you're going to see here in just a little bit, are actually problems in the corporate world. It's something that corporate NDAs have to be very careful from putting in those NDAs because they could infringe on employee rights. But let's go back to these basic NDAs. Let's look through this basic NDA and you just tell me, because it would be bolded, do you see a non compete in this basic NDA? Nope, not in that first one. So let's look at the second one. Do you see a non compete in this NDA? These are basic NDA templates. This one's an NDA for employees. I don't see a non compete. Maybe it's down here at the bottom. Nope, there's no non compete. So again, there's another element that doesn't fit the basic definition of an NDA. But as I'm looking at these NDAs, they don't have these non competes. Okay, so that is another element that I have an issue with here, that I have a concern with. So we've looked at that non competition clause. Now let's look at one more piece that is important, two more pieces, really. Now you have a non disparagement clause. If you go to spiritualabuse.institute, you look at our NDA disclosure database, you're going to notice that one of the things that we have kind of always said is the existence of a broad non disparagement clause constitutes an NDA itself. It doesn't have to be a non disclosure agreement, it could be a severance agreement, it could be an employee handbook, anywhere that you see. It could even be a membership covenant. If you see a non disparagement clause, we consider that an NDA, especially if it's overly broad. So let's look at what does non disparagement mean here in this NDA. Executive agrees and covenants that the executive will not at any time directly or indirectly make, publish, or communicate to any person or any entity in any public forum, including social media. You can't talk to any person, period. You can't say anything to any person that is defamatory or disparaging remarks, comments, or statements that adversely affects Daystar or its businesses or any of its employees, officers, and existing and prospective customers, suppliers, viewers, partners, investors, and other associated third parties. So let's just talk about this for a second. Defamatory. You can't make any defamatory remarks. Is that okay to be put in an NDA? The answer is yes and no. It's okay. It's not necessary. If you put you can't make defamatory remarks in an NDA, it is easier to hold someone to that NDA. It is easier to sue them for breach of contract than it is to sue them for defamation. But the reality is, defamation is already a law. We can't go defame people. We can't say, and what is defamation? It's I'm saying false and malicious things about you. And I knew they were false and malicious things about you. And I just said those to hurt you. So yeah, we can't just go saying and printing false things to hurt someone else. But again, why do they put these in here? It's not necessary because there's already a law. Well, defamation laws have a pretty high bar, and they should. So some companies have found it is a lot easier to sue you for breach of contract. That's a much lower bar than defamation in general, especially if we're defining defamation. But they didn't stop with just defamation. They said disparaging remarks. Look up disparagement, not legal corporate disparagement, because that is basically false advertising from one corporation to another. We're talking about general disparagement from a person, because this is interpersonal. All right. Disparaging remarks can be true. The difference between disparagement and defamation is I'm saying something false and malicious to hurt you. Disparaging, I could be saying something true, something necessary, something I'm convicted about, and it is true. It's important to me, but it could hurt your reputation. All right. And this isn't just any type of disparagement. You can't make any disparaging remarks, any comments, any statements. And here's the thing, they're broadening this definition even more, that adversely affects Daystar or its businesses, employees, officers, in any way. Now, this isn't just saying it affects us negatively because another company can take our trade secrets monetarily. No, no, no. You can't, from this, my understanding would be that you can't disparage them at all in any way that would hurt their business. So, hey, they're not operating, and I'm not saying this is true. This is just a hypothetical example. If you were to sign this, you couldn't say that a company is not handling their finances correctly. You can't say that there are leadership is not treating its employees correctly. That stuff is important. That stuff's important for the public to know. That stuff could be something that somebody wants to talk about. Hey, I left because of the culture there. Well, you couldn't say that because that could hurt their business. And because it's disparagement, even though it's true, it doesn't matter. Could it hurt us? Could it hurt our reputation? Could it hurt our business? And if so, you can't do it. That is an overly broad definition of non disparagement, in my view. And that clause by itself, if it stopped right here, this is enough to be an NDA by itself. From the way that we look at them, that clause itself would make any document a silencing NDA. Okay. Now it says, again, this does not in any way restrict or impede the executive from exercising protected rights, complying with any applicable law or regulation or a valid court order. That sounds great. But watch this last part. Provided that such compliance with a court order, compliance with the law, provided that such compliance does not exceed that required by the law, regulation, order, which means, yes, this NDA can't keep you from requiring with the law, cooperating with the law, but you shouldn't share anything that is not absolutely required by the law. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm not an attorney. I'm not a judge. I'm not a police officer. I'm not a law expert in any way. So I would have a lot of questions about what is required of me. What is the minimum amount required of me? Because that's the only thing that I could share, even about criminal activity, right? I've got to make sure if I say anything that exceeds what is required by law, regulation, or order, then I'm breaking my NDA. So again, do you see why this detective wanted to see the NDA? I think it's becoming more clear because things like that, he could tell them, hey, what's actually required by law is this. He can make that clear. Or he could say, hey, actually, even if it's not 100% required, you can cooperate with me and that wouldn't break that NDA. He could bring clarity. Probably a reason why he wanted to see it. Okay. He's probably seen things like this before because most of what he was asking JW and Rebecca about wasn't the minimum required by law. And they could have really wondered, should I be talking about this or not? Okay. It could have caused fear. It could have caused them to be silent. And then it says executive shall promptly provide written notice of any such order to the chief human resources officer at Daystar. And this is more normal. It's in a lot of them, but I'm just telling you, if law enforcement is asking me to talk about something, I don't think I should have to tell a corporation that I work for or that I used to work for that law enforcement is asking me about that. What is the reason for that? The reason for that, as I see it, my opinion is in most cases, this is so that you can get coaching on what you should say and what you shouldn't, and probably so the corporation could provide an attorney. Isn't it interesting that one of Daystar's attorneys was right there with them? Because if I'm informing you that I'm talking to law based off this NDA, and I think that's exactly what JW and Rebecca did, well, now that person's in there. They can not only coach you, but they can run interference. That's one thing. The last thing I want to look at is remedies and tolling here. In the event that a breach or threatened breach of this agreement by the executive is to happen, Daystar shall be entitled to injunctive relief and may apply to any court for specific performance, temporary, preliminary, or permanent injunctive relief. All of that is basically saying that is essentially that's the threat. We can take legal action. We can sue. We can stop you. That's the fear factor right there. If you don't do what we say, we can sue. We can take you to court. We got more money than you. We can do all that. That is kind of where the fear comes from in those. So again, JW says this is a basic NDA. So let's look at these basic NDAs. Let's see if we see non-disparagement in any of these. You are going to see remedies and tolling. I'm going to go ahead and tell you that. All of these NDAs are basically a threat to sue if you don't hold your end of the bargain. The difference is in a corporation, a threat to sue is not nearly as uncomfortable as it is with a Christian organization, a church, or a ministry, given that the Bible actually teaches us we shouldn't be taking each other to court, but we shouldn't be suing each other in front of unbelievers. So that's a totally different deal. But let's just ask, because JW says this is a basic NDA. Do these basic NDAs, look at two of them, do they have a non disparagement clause? I don't see anything here. Relationship, severability, integration, waiver, notice of immunity. Nope, that's the end of it. There is no non disparagement clause in the first one, but let's look at the second one. Maybe this is an employee issue. So let's look at the basic NDA template for employee NDAs. You get scope of the agreement, confidential information, definitions, exclusions, period. Oh, by the way, there's an end date in these basic NDAs. There's not an end date usually in the others. A good, even basic NDAs that offer the option like this one does for no end date, many attorneys are going to tell you if you're going to sign one, you want an end date because otherwise that's very burdensome. Okay. And a lot of courts, again, I'm not a legal expert, but from my understanding, a lot of courts will throw them out if they don't have or not hold them completely true if these agreements don't have an end date. Limitations, ownership, inventions, entire agreement, nature of relationship. None of this is non disparagement, indemnification, injunctive release, none of that. So we're looking at two basic NDAs. And what happened with both of these basic NDAs? Neither of these basic NDAs had the markers that we're concerned about with this Daystar NDA. Yet, JW and Rebecca told the detective, this is just a basic NDA. This is just a regular corporate NDA. This is just a basic NDA, right? Well, the answer to that question, Rebecca, is no. This does not appear to be just a basic NDA, a basic corporate NDA. And for SAI, this meets multiple of the elements that we consider as a silencing NDA. And again, these can be things that keep people from telling the truth or make people fearful about telling the truth. So can you see with these elements why the detective was asking these questions? Because there's multiple elements from the definition of confidential to non-disparaging to, hey, work with law enforcement, but only to the minimum degree, essentially, that is required by law, only what is absolutely required of you. Can you see how those things would make someone scared to tell the truth in a police investigation? Okay, to me, those are valid questions, they're valid concerns. That doesn't mean that's what Daystar was trying to do. I can't say that. I don't know their motives. That's why in this NDA disclosure database, we don't ever talk about people's motives. We say a church or ministry using these documents doesn't mean they're bad or abusive or doing anything wrong, but it is a cause for concern, we believe, and we think the public should know. But as far as I can tell through these recordings, that NDA was never given to the detective. So he probably still to this day would likely have concerns. I wonder if there's stuff they didn't tell me because they were scared about the NDA. This is why I believe Jonathan and Susie told him, hey, there's an NDA. It could potentially cause them to be silent. It doesn't mean that they would be silent about a crime, but the majority of what they were talking about was not specifically a crime, but it was relevant to an investigation. This is why we challenge churches and ministries on the use of NDAs. It's why we say, while they're not evil or bad by themselves, we don't recommend it as a best practice. It's why we ask churches that take the Safe Church Pledge not to use NDAs and to release people from former NDAs unless they're specifically to protect parishioners, okay? And it's why we're doing this NDA database, because we believe that donors, parishioners, staff members have the right to know if a church or ministry they're a part of is using these. Because again, if you look at this legally, if you take this to an attorney, I sat down just yesterday talking to one of our attorneys about these NDAs, and multiple of the elements that we've seen in this NDA from Daystar, multiple of these elements are the ones that he and I were talking about saying, hey, those aren't necessary for churches to use. They run a much greater risk of causing someone to have fear about telling the truth. And in the church, no one should have fear, in my opinion, about telling the truth. But maybe that's just me. What do you think about the situation? Now that you've heard about the NDA from JW and Rebecca, you heard about this detective asking for the NDAs and why, you've seen pieces of this NDA, and you've seen two NDAs in their entirety that are basic NDA templates. Do you think this goes beyond what JW said? Let's revisit these questions. First of all, he said, this is just really saying we're not going to go slander on social media. None of those basic NDAs talked about slandering on social media. The Daystar NDA includes social media, but it didn't say you couldn't slander people on social media because, again, slander is defamation, which is we can't go say false things on social media. All right. but it also had a non-disparagement clause. And that non-disparagement clause, did it go well beyond slandering on social media? Yes. It went to, you can't say true things if they could hurt Daystar and its businesses. Second thing he said, this is just a basic corporate NDA. Or actually, he said this is just about trade secrets. So again, was that confidential definition? Do you think it just applied to trade secrets? When it started applying to the actions and decisions of executives, I would say no. I think it was overly broad, but that is for you to decide. And then the last thing, does this NDA, as we've seen just these few pieces, does this match a basic corporate NDA? As we've looked at two of them. Again, that's for you to decide. But from my perspective, it does not match the two basic NDAs that we have looked at. Now, maybe you can find some that it does match, but it doesn't match any of the ones that I've signed. It doesn't match any of the ones that I've seen in business day to day. It doesn't match any of the ones that I've asked people to sign when we're talking about proprietary information and tools and how things work. So to me, I don't think this NDA is what JW thought. And again, guys, to be very clear, I don't think JW or Rebecca were lying or being dishonest. I think this is what they've been told. And they're trusting not only their boss, not only are they probably trusting lawyers and HR representatives at their place of work, but this is Rebecca's mom. This is JW's mother-in-law. This is their family. It's really hard to go against your family and go, "Oh, you know what? Let me look into this to see if you're telling me the truth about this NDA." And I think that's probably what led to the hesitation. But let me know in the comments. Let me know in the chat what you think, where you think I got it right, where you think I got it wrong. What are your concerns with just a little bit that you know about this NDA? And do you see how this could cause someone like JW or Rebecca to have concern about sharing the truth? One of the things that you are going to find as we look in the next segment, as we look at more of these interviews, you're going to hear JW say about a housekeeper, for instance, that had some important, relevant information to share. She's terrified to share it. So if she signed an NDA like this, could that NDA cause someone like the housekeeper to have that fear that he talks about? Let me know in the chat below. But that's all for this one. We'll be back with another one soon. But until then, grace and peace.